This narrated set of notes introduces the highlights for weeks 4 and 5 topics, focusing on working with pivot tables and pivot charts derived from pivot tables. Week 4, Part 2 covers Module 5, Session 3 in your text. Here are the major themes for Module 5, Session 3, working with pivot tables and creating pivot charts. The Session 5.3 objectives include creating and modifying a pivot table, applying pivot table styles and formatting, using a filter with a pivot table, inserting a slicer as a filter to a pivot table, considering the recommended pivot tables. These are predefined templates that are likely to solve the problem you want to solve when you go to build your pivot table, and creating a pivot chart from a pivot table. Session 5.3 will require some extra time and attention as you learn about and work through the module exercises covering pivot tables and pivot charts. This is a powerful and impressive Excel tool, so take your time and read the narrative carefully. When a table contains large amounts of data, it often becomes difficult to obtain a clear view of that information. Pivot tables help organize data by summarizing ranges of data into categories using functions such as count, sum, average, the max, or the min for the columns. It can provide the ability to pivot the table, which means we can rearrange, hide, and display different category fields to provide alternative views of the data. So these are both called tables, so let's make a comparison here so we understand that the pivot table is meant to provide a big picture view. It provides a more abstract view, an overall summary of large data sets that we have already defined in an Excel table or a range of data. We use the pivot table to summarize that table data. Frequently, we will display the table columns as totals. You can pivot the rows into columns. We can use built-in filters of field values, or we can use recommended pivot tables, as well as custom build our own pivot tables. We frequently present column totals in the pivot table and provide filters for ignoring the details that we are not interested in, while focusing on those that we are. Pivot tables can be used to provide a report summary about the particular data set. Let's see a sample of the sales data from Session 5.2 presented as a pivot table. On the right, we see part of our sales data table from Session 5.1. Remember, this got rather large, with over 100 records in the table. On the left, we see the summary of the daily sales filtered for Monday through Friday. This gives us a big picture idea of the sales during the week, regardless of the type of business, residential, group home, etc. Now that we understand the power and purpose of pivot tables, let's consider a few more important details. Rule number 1, it is important to plan the summary data you wish to convey. Here we see a sketch of the summary data that our boss wants us to include in our pivot table for the June data set. On the right, we see the pivot table fields dialog box. This will allow us to add data to the pivot table based on the columns or fields from our sales data table. Fields that contain summary data are called values fields. Fields that group the values in the pivot table are called category fields. So we'll be using category field for the different types of businesses. We add fields to the pivot table from the pivot table fields pane that we see here on the right. It is divided into two sections. The upper section, the field section, lists the names of each field in the data source. The bottom section determines where these fields, if we include them, will wind up in the pivot table. We can use them to become filters, rows, columns, or values. At the very bottom of the dialog box, you'll see the option for creating the pivot table in a new worksheet. To analyze the data in a pivot table, you might want to show only a portion of the total data. In order to do this, we can do a filter. And notice that this is all done dynamically. Once we build the pivot table, we can change things up in terms of our view. The filter button will allow us to add a field to the filters area or remove. We can add a report filter to a pivot table to create a filtered view of the pivot table report. Filter pivot table fields to focus on a subset of items in that field. So right now in this pivot table, we have eliminated the Saturday sales because we were just interested in viewing Monday through Friday. We can change the layout of a pivot table by adding, removing, and rearranging fields in the pivot table's layout. Once we've created the pivot table, you can view the same data in different ways. Each time you make a change in the Areas section of the pivot table field pane, the pivot table layout is rearranged. We can also quickly format a pivot table report using one of the built-in styles available. You will practice this in your module lab. We can format cells in a pivot table the same way that you format cells in a worksheet. Here we see the use of filtering via a slicer. This is another way to filter a pivot table. We can create the slicer from any field in the pivot table fields pane. In this case, we are using the sales ID. The slicer contains a button for each unique value in that field. You can format the slicer and its buttons, changing its style, height, and width. You can create more than one slicer at a time. After applying the slicer to this pivot table, we are looking only at Sales ID 2, which is Salesperson 2's summary sales for group homes and residential, as we have applied a filter on the business as well as using the Sales ID slicer. Note: you cannot change data directly in a pivot table. You must edit the data source on which the pivot table is created. This makes sense. Remember that we have stored summary data in our pivot table. So in order to change the data directly in the table, you have to go to the table the pivot table was built upon. Once you do that, the pivot table is not automatically updated. This is something you have to do on purpose by refreshing your pivot table. So after you edit the underlying data, you need to refresh or update the pivot table in order to reflect the revised calculations. You will also practice this in Module 5, Session 3. A recommended pivot table is like a template, but it is created based on the data table that you're building a pivot table from. On the Analyze ribbon, underneath it you'll see Recommended Pivot Tables. You select those two items and you will see a list of recommended pivot tables be presented. This is smart Excel. It is making a guess as to the type of pivot tables you might be interested in presenting. It lets you see different options that you can choose from. Now, my recommendation is you start here when you're building pivot tables. After you've practiced with building the first one in the lab, so you understand how they're created using the field dialog box. But frequently, probably 95 times out of 100, you'll find what you're looking for here in the recommended pivot tables. And if not, you'll find one that's close enough to use as a starter that you can make some edits to show the pivot table you want. Creating pivot charts. A pivot chart is a graphical representation of the data in the pivot table. It allows you to interactively add, remove, filter, and refresh data fields. Pivot charts have all the same formatting capabilities of ordinary charts, including layouts and styles. You can move and resize chart elements or change formatting of individual data points. A pivot chart and its associated pivot table are linked. When you modify one, the other also changes. Now remember here, we're not modifying data, we're modifying the view of the data. You can quickly display different views of the pivot chart by using the chart filter buttons on the pivot chart to filter the data. Notice that we see two on the pivot chart sales by day here for the day and sale date. If we make an adjustment to the chart, we'll see it automatically reflected in the report table to the left of it. For example, we could choose to ignore Saturday by selecting the chart's day filter. This will remove Saturday field summary from view on both the chart and the pivot table. Pivot tables and their corresponding charts are powerful tools in spreadsheets. For large data sets, they can really help provide a needed big picture summary of the data. Module 5 was spread across 2 weeks with a project because of the importance of the pivot table's utility. Once you complete Module 5, you are ready to tackle Project 1. If you have any questions or wish to discuss any of these features, post to the Week 4-5 forum.